Hello and welcome to the PhD Life Raft podcast. I'm Emma Brzezinski and today I am talking to the awesome Catherine Pope. We're talking about Catherine's book, How to Publish Your PhD. And we discuss then this process after you have submitted and completed putting your material out into the world and the sorts of decisions you might want to make in terms of how to publish, and then the ways in which thinking like a publisher may be different from thinking like a PhD researcher. So I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Catherine.
Hello, Emma.
Welcome back. Because you have been on the podcast before.
I have. It's great to be back.
Thank you for coming. Before we were talking about one of your wonderful books. This time we're talking about another one of your wonderful books. And because you've already been here before, you've already talked about your story of through the PhD. Very interesting, and you talk about that a lot in the book, How to Get a PhD. And this time we're here to talk about your book, How to Publish Your PhD. So I wonder if you could talk to us then about this topic and you coming into publishing your PhD material.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so I thought that once I'd finished my PhD, nothing else could be that difficult, and
right.
Turning it into a monograph would be some kind of straightforward magic trick, because people talk about turning it into a monograph, so there are a couple of easy steps that you follow and suddenly it's reappeared in a different format. And of course the reality was completely different. I was horrified. I don't think that's an overstatement, to be confronted with the reality, and there were just so many processes and obstacles. So I felt very strongly I needed to share this with other people, because often turning your thesis into a monograph is seen very much as a formality. Yeah, so we get shunted along that path without really spending the time thinking through whether it's something that we want to do. So I wrote this book to share my insights and insights from other researchers who I'd spoken to, so that people can make an informed decision about whether they publish their PhD and also how they go about it.
Brilliant. And I think we were talking just before we came on about, because I know I've done it too, that and you talk about in the book about how PhD examiners often say that thing in terms of like, and you really should publish this work. As you say, like it's an easy thing to do. Because for those examiners, it may well have been an easier thing to do. Things have changed, and there's a very particular environment around, that people will be finding themselves in, both in terms of getting a job after the PhD and in terms of the publishing environment. And you are able in talking about how to publish the book, How to Publish a PhD, you can talk about it both from being someone who has been published, someone who you have your own publishing house, and also looking at the work of working with other people as they get published. So you were going to talk, we've thought about how we might approach this best. And you suggested that we start with, or do you really want to publish this? Is this really what you want to do? So tell us a bit about that in terms of why might you not want to publish a PhD?
Yeah, sure. I think starting with why is always the best place, asking yourself why you want to do a PhD or why you want to write a book, so that it isn't just a formality, because other people are very good at giving us advice.
Yes.
So once you passed your Viva, everyone is saying, oh yes, that's very nice, but when are you going to turn it into a book? It's similar to if you get married and when are you going to have a baby? And
Mm.
people are very nosy. Um, and they can then just ask you every time you see them, well, how's that book coming along? And it's really annoying. And they're not going to be the ones who are sat out with you late at night trying to squeeze out another 500 words or doing endless edits. So it's very
Yes.
easy to make suggestions, but a lot harder to actually write that book. And I've done quite a lot of coaching on writing books in the past. I don't do that any longer. But the first question I always ask someone if they say that they want to write a book is, what are you going to stop doing? Because most people haven't got oodles of spare time where they're thinking, oh, I don't know what to do with myself this evening or this coming weekend. How on earth am I going to use all this annual leave? So you've got to think: is there something that you're going to stop? Because writing a book takes a lot of time. You're going to be either sacrificing a lot of your evenings, or making some early starts, or using up a big block of your weekend. And if you've got some semblance of a life or caring responsibilities, that's going to have a big impact. And if you don't prioritize writing the book, you're never going to make any progress, and it's just going to drag out interminably, like sometimes PhDs do. You don't
Yes.
want to be still working on it in 10 years' time.
Yes, and I think that is really important to say at the outset. Like you say, it is quite unlikely to be just tweaking things to publish it, especially if you're going to publish it as a book. So tell us a little bit then about that process of what it might mean then to change to work from the thesis into a published book.
Yeah, so first of all, as you've alluded to, Emma, don't believe anyone who says, oh, it's just a few tweaks, this is almost there. That is an enormous lie.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a lot of work, and I talk about this in the book because I'd flattered myself that it wouldn't be too much effort to turn my thesis into a monograph, because I'd had very few corrections, just typos, and my examiners had praised its coherence and the quality of the writing. So I was feeling quite puffed up afterwards. And of course, when I opened my thesis to start editing it, I was absolutely appalled, because there were lots of typos, there were mistakes, there were things that just plain didn't make sense. Some paragraphs I just couldn't work out what on earth I was talking about there. And my thinking had changed. In places it was a bit dated, because I was writing about race and gender and sexuality. So what I thought was going to take me a couple of months of gentle editing was actually, I think the main transformation was solid 6 months work.
Wow.
Yeah. And then even after I'd done all that, you've got to submit that manuscript, and it goes through readers and editors who all come back, and that takes time. So it was actually, I think, 3 years before the book was published, and all that time it's going back and forth, and you're having to occupy some of your headspace with it and keep up with your research.
Yes, and you really help. I mean, what's brilliant about this book is it's very practical, and you have things like the timeline in terms of what will need to happen in terms of the processes for getting published. And I'm really aware that people may be looking to get their book published in order to be going for a particular job. And so can you talk a little bit about that in terms of if that is where your thinking is at? Because you give some options in the book about what you might do with your material that you have coming out of your PhD process.
Yeah, sure. So part of that starting with why is really pinpointing why you want to publish your PhD, what it's going to do for you,
Yeah.
what's your goal. And as you say, if you want to get an academic job, you've got to really pay attention to your pathway, because if a academic institution says you need to have published your monograph before you can apply for a job here, it might take you 3 years. In some cases, it takes 7 years to actually get that book published after you've submitted it. So are you really going to wait that long to get a full-time job? Other employers will say you just need to have a book under contract, which is obviously easier, but even so, you still have to put together a really good proposal and have it accepted, and that could still take maybe a year or something. So it's, whatever you're doing, it's important not discount reality or indulge in any magical thinking, which is something that I've been very good at in the past.
Oh yes, me too. And you just mentioned there in terms of book under contract, because actually getting into thinking about publishing takes you into a whole another landscape with a whole another set of it's a whole new language and a whole new set of processes, and you need to kind of think like a publisher, and which you talk about this really. I keep going on about this book, but it is brilliant, so do have a look at it, and we'll have all the details in the show notes. But you're very helpful in the book in terms of introducing that and encouraging people to think like a publisher. But I wonder if you could give us a little sort of précis now in terms of how do publishers approach books and what are they thinking about, because it's quite different from academics.
Definitely. Yeah. So a publisher is making a business decision when they review your book proposal. In universities, and particularly on PhD programs, you're trying to produce an idea that's completely unique, that no one has ever discussed at length before. So that uniqueness is privileged, and you've only got to convince 2 or maybe 3 people that this presents an important contribution to knowledge. But publishers aren't interested in something that's incredibly niche and appeals to a handful of people, because they need to sell a certain number of copies. And experienced publishers are going to be looking at your proposal, and they will see very quickly, yes, this is something that might sell 500 copies to libraries, or they will look at it and think this is going to sell 2 copies. And regardless of the type of publisher, whether they're a commercial publisher like Palgrave, or they're an academic press like CUP, or they're a not-for-profit like Open Book Publishers, they all need to sell books. Even if they're not trying to make money from your book, they are allocating resources that could have been used on another title, and they still need money coming in to keep the presses rolling. So you've got to, as you say, Emma, think like the publisher. It's not about your idea being exciting and interesting, because I'm sure it is, but those aren't the important criteria for the publisher. They need to know that it's of sufficient interest to sell copies. So for some publishers, that threshold will be 200 copies if it's a book that's very expensive, one of those ones that's sort of £150. For others, it might be 500 copies or 2,000 copies. But books always sell far fewer copies than we think. I think it's something like only 5% of books sell more than 100 copies, and that's all books trade. And
isn't it really?
Yeah.
Blimey.
So
but, yeah, I because and this is the key thing, isn't it, in terms of when you're putting together, and you do walk people through this, the book proposal thing, but that the book proposal is basically a business proposal, right? It's for the marketing department.
Exactly.
In terms of, can we sell this book? And I think that is a real shock. I know I found that very shocking to kind of get my head around that. It's a very different way of approaching things, and the kind of the surveying the market is the big thing that you have to do, rather than talking through your argumentation.
Because as you said earlier, Emma, publishers think about research very differently from other academics. So they're not looking for something that's really, really niche. They want something that sells. This was the problem with my PhD. Actually, the first publisher I approached responded with a no, I think 5 minutes after I'd sent the email. And I wished he'd just waited at least an hour or something to make it look as though he thought about it. But he just came back almost immediately saying, no, this is far too niche. No one's going to be interested in that. And just because we find it really fascinating, we can't imagine that other people won't. And people will be broadly interested, but it's whether they will actually pay for a copy, because publishers need buyers, not just readers. As academics, we want readers for our books, and we're not usually expecting to make any money. But the publishers do need to get people to buy a copy. They don't want everyone just going to the British Library and reading it for free. That's no good for a publisher when they've covered all the costs.
And I think that's really important to hold on to as well, in terms of not taking it personally, that rejection, because it probably won't be about the ideas and the argumentation.
No.
Because there are lots of brilliant ideas out there. And also, the editors that potentially you're approaching, they can really love what you're doing, but they just know that it's not going to sell in that way. So that's where the rejection comes from, to not take that personally, because I think it can be really disheartening, to, especially when you come out and you're like, this is my PhD and I've passed, and to then come up against that kind of that process, but to be smart about it. And I think that to you give really good tips in terms of how to craft and create a proposal that touches on all the things that will be of interest to the publisher. But I think what I'd love to touch on too is, so if there's this monograph with an established press as one option for publishing your PhD, but you do touch on some other options for publishing too. And I just wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about that in terms of the other options that people might have for publishing their work.
Yeah, so really this comes down to your motivation for publishing. If you are pursuing an academic career, then there are other things that you could do, such as publishing chapters of your thesis as journal articles. It's not necessarily less work, but it might be easier to do in terms of placing those articles. Or I do talk about contributing to an edited collection. I think I strongly advise against editing a collection, because that's just a world of pain. But it depends on your motivation, and also what universities are looking for in your field. So certainly in my field of Victorian literature, nothing other than a monograph would suffice. But in other fields, it might be more about journal articles if you're in the social sciences, or a contribution to an edited collection might be sufficient. So find out what would be appropriate. If you're not pursuing an academic career, either you're never going to do that, or you're having a bit of a break, then you could look at other approaches. For instance, self-publishing, I talk about in my book. Of course, you don't get the same credibility as you do with getting it published. But if you just want to get your research out there to the widest possible audience, that's probably the best way, because you can set the price.
Yes.
It's not going to be £120 for a paperback and £500,000 for a hardback, as it often is. And you can make sure it's available internationally as well. Because I've spoken to some researchers who've carried out ethnographies in certain countries, and they want those participants to be able to read the research, and then the publisher either doesn't make it available in that territory, or it's just ridiculously expensive in relation to the cost of living there. So do think about whether going down a traditional route is placing any barriers between your work and the intended readers. And you could also go down completely different routes, turning your research into a blog or a podcast, videos, all sorts of things. It's your research, so that you can do exactly what you like with it. And once you've signed a contract with a publisher, they've got the rights to it. You then can't decide to transform it into all sorts of different artifacts. You have to get permission from them. So if it's important to you to have control over what you do with it and who can read it, then self-publishing, or at least autonomy, might be a better route.
Yeah, so it's thinking about disseminating your research, isn't it? I guess really, and what would serve you best, and money might be part of that for you, and what might reach the people that you want to reach. You may have a particular audience in mind as well, mightn't you? You might have a particular, like you say, geographical area that you want to speak to, or a particular community that you want to speak to, and you know that this is where they hang out rather than the British Library. And so you're thinking about where you want to put that work. Considerations in terms of those kind of big considerations in terms of why and how. What's brilliant in your book as well is it is very practical in terms of thinking about that timelines, editing, the kind of setting out weekly strategies and things, in terms of, because if people are publishing their PhDs, they're likely to be doing other things at the same time. So this project is likely to happen without the luxury of being able to do it full time. So I think that's what's you give some great prompts there. And I always ask people on the podcast in terms for top tips, and I just wonder if you had any top tips for people who are working on or thinking about getting their PhD published.
Sure. Yes. So first of all, start with why. Really interrogate yourself as to why this is the right thing for you to do and why you should be doing it now, and really drill down. So you might have heard of the 5 whys exercise, where you ask yourself, why do I want to do this? And then you give your answer and you say, well, why is that the answer? And each time you're getting more specific. And sometimes we realize that our reason is really quite shallow and defying. So be clear on yourself, be clear to yourself why you're doing this and what it's going to do for you. Think about what you're going to give up in order to make space for this book project, because it's not just time, it's a lot of energy. I say in the book that you need starting energy and finishing energy.
Yes.
So there's a lot of starting energy to get going, doing all the planning, holding these big ideas in your head. But that's quite exciting. You get a lot of adrenaline with starting energy, because projects are always exciting at the start, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Then you get to the boring bits and you think, well, no, this other project that's much better. That'll be easier. I can't foresee any problems with that at all.
You're inside my head right now, Catherine.
So there's that mad flurry of activity at the beginning, and then there's the sort of plodding along, which is a bit easier to fit around your other activities, but also it's quite dull, or it can be, and you've got to keep yourself motivated. And then at the end, it's just when you're exhausted and regretting ever having started this, you've got to pull everything together. You've got endless edits. You've got people coming back with queries and saying, why did you say it like this? What's the page reference for this thing that you read 10 years ago? So you're going to have to deal with these different phases. And if you don't keep on top of it and maintain your momentum, then it just drags out forever and it becomes harder and harder. So I said this in my previous podcast interview with you, Emma, that there was this big slump in the middle of my PhD when I pretended that I just wasn't doing one because I had a full-time job as well, and I very successfully ignored it for almost 6 months. And astonishingly, it wasn't busy writing itself in the meantime, and I just forgotten everything that I'd been working on before that slump. So there's a big risk of that happening with the book as well. And publishers tend to be a lot less patient these days, and they will give you quite tight deadlines.
Yes.
12 months is common, and 6 months I'm hearing quite
Good grief.
Quite, yeah.
Good grief.
So you've got to maintain a lively clip to
Absolutely.
do that if you've got a full-time job or other responsibilities.
Yes, which makes it even more important that you have a sense of the scope of your project and what you're looking to do and what's possible to do with that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, another tip is to be realistic. Don't keep adding things to your scope and think, oh, this is a really interesting idea over here, and bolting it on. You need. I talked, I think, on the previous episode about the minimum viable thesis.
Yes.
Yeah, so you need a minimum viable book. There are all sorts of things that you could do to make this amazing, but you just need something that answers the question that you set out in the introduction. So keep it as something that you can actually finish in the time allotted.
And as you were talking there about kind of coming back, people asking you questions in terms of getting involved, having proofreaders and indexers and all those other processes that you need for publication, which might cost you money, and certainly will take time. I think it's what's great is to have that you lay that out, because I think again it's people are not always aware that these processes take place, and
or that your publisher will just deal with all of them, and it's vanishingly rare for a publisher to do all the editing, proofreading and indexing for you. So I'm glad you brought that up, Emma. So there could be significant financial implications to publishing your PhD, even if you go with a well-known publisher.
And it's just good to know that in advance, isn't it, and to have that as part of your thinking, because it might be absolutely the right thing for you to do, but at least there's no nasty surprises. Catherine, thank you so much. And I really want to recommend, if people didn't hear the first interview, to go back and listen to that, because there is so much more wisdom in there. What I love about the books that you write is it comes out of your experience, and this is kind of hard-won knowledge that you are sharing with us. So thank you for that.
My pleasure, Emma.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Emma, and good luck to everyone with your publishing adventures.